All right. So this is Cash for Kids article by Bittler, Hines, and Page. So this article may be a little different than some of the other articles that you'll be um, reading this semester, in that this one may not do as much of a study as some of the other ones. This one takes a lot of what they already know, which is called a literature review, and they then um, expound on the literature review and then look at a policy recommendation. So, other than this being probably one of the worst names of a research article, Cash for Kids, let's talk a little bit about what they look at in this article. So, the premise behind this article is that children who grow up in poverty have a lot of strikes against them. The article talks about that those who grow up in poverty um, are more likely, and to be honest, are much more likely to be in poverty when they're adults. There's not a lot of moving from in poverty to out of poverty, as we would like to think there is. So, one of the stats they talk about is that for every 1 year in poverty in childhood, that the child is more than 10 times as likely to be poor when they're 35 than if they had never been poor as a child. So, poverty is one of these things that's very hard to get out of. And then when you're in poverty as children, what we find is that there are studies have found, and this what this article talks about, that there is a difference between kids in poverty and kids out of poverty. There's an educational gap. So it talks about that there is between high and low income children. There's a 50% educational gap. Um, so education. So we look at that, but we know that academic performance is a predictor of future economic success. So what that shows is that these kids are more likely to remain in poverty. There's also studies that find that, though, and that this article talks about, that those in poverty are more likely to encounter mental illness. They're more likely to encounter health issues. They're more likely to have children who are born below weight or are born early and have all those health issues that come with it. So there's a lot of issues as it relates to childhood poverty. And so, what this article is focused on is trying to determine ways that are out there that may look at improving um, children in poverty, ways to try to find means to get children out of poverty. So, the next part of the article talks quite a bit about some of the areas that we have out there already. It talks about the temporary assistance for needy families, which you'll see referred to as TANF. Child tax credits are out there. There is earned income tax credit. And the article talks about how, while these are federal benefits, if the parent or parents don't have earned income, they can't get an earned income tax credit. They can't get a child tax credit. If they don't file their taxes, they're not going to be able to get that. Um, there's also something called Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. A lot of people colloquially call it food stamps, but there's that program also, which are considered near cash benefits. Basically, you get a card that allows you to go purchase food items, but not everybody takes those, as the article explains, because there is a stigma attached to it. So they don't want to be seen as taking um, quote unquote welfare, quote unquote government handout. So this article talks about the different studies that are out there, and have looked and said, okay, what are some ways that, we have looked that, researchers have looked into this. Researchers have seen the difference. One of the interesting articles that they talk about in this article is one that looked at job displacement. They looked at what happens if mom and dad or mom or dad get laid off, what happens to the child. So they looked at mass layoffs. And so they looked and said, okay, one of the articles looked at what happens if there's a mass layoff. And what they found was that there is a difference in the children whose parents experienced that mass layoff. Um, those children had greater issues that we talked about a few seconds ago because that there was a shock to the family's income. And so, that's another thing that if you have and I believe the research that they quote is a Canadian study. I think it's Canada. Um, but what they find that, when they have that happen, that if your parent had a unexpected layoff or job shock, when you became an adult, your income was 9% lower than those whose parents did not experience that. And 9% is a fairly strong number. And so what they're looking at is we want to try to minimize that because we understand that there are issues that come with childhood poverty, and those issues don't end when you're 18. Those issues continue. So then you have what's called generational poverty. You have poverty that goes from one generation to another. There's a term, it's not talked about in this paper, but there's a term called persistent poverty. And that's when you look at certain geographic areas where there's been a high percentage of people living below the poverty line for more than 30 years, more than more than 3 decades of census work. And so there are some counties that have had persistent poverty since they've started measuring that in the early 1900s. Mississippi County and Arkansas, which is the Blytheville area, they've had persistent poverty. They've had high poverty rates ever since they first started measuring these. So you see how these problems can compound on each other. And so this article talks about some of those issues. The article then moves into looking at ways to try to change that. And what they look at in this is that they look at cash assistance. And basically what that means is it's a universal income for children. So I think they look, the number they look at, and their research has found, looking at some other research areas, is they found that around $2,000 per child will have an impact, positive impact. So the first part of this article is what I would consider a very detailed literature review. Went into great detail. Normally a literature review is 3 or 4 pages, and it kind of gives an overview. This is a policy paper, so this policy paper does a deep dive into existing literature and what's out there now and what all these researchers have found. And when you read this, you'll notice it's telling a story. It's telling you, here are the problems, here's what research has looked at that has shown you how these problems persist. Here's how research has shown you some ways to help improve these problems, and here's what our policy is. So their policy recommendation is to have a simple cash assistance program, $2,000 per student, $2,000 per child, and every child gets it is their program regardless of income, although they do talk a little bit about making it income, have it phase out. But the reason why, when you read it, they want it to be per child and not be income phased out is because when things start becoming income phased out, a stigma attaches to it, and you don't want, some people don't want that stigma attached that they're taking something that's for quote unquote poor people. They don't want to consider themselves quote unquote poor. So you have this in there where every child gets this amount of money, and regardless of income. And they talk about making it what's called budget neutral because, as you know, we have a Congress that sometimes decides they don't want to increase the deficit, although sometimes they say they don't and they still increase it anyway. But the way to make it budget neutral, they give explanation of how they would do that, how they would reduce some of the other benefits that are out there now that maybe not everyone takes advantage of. And then it talks about how this will have an impact, and they do a good job of showing it has an impact on all groups, all families. It based on individual families based on race. So here you see for African American families, red is the proposed benefit, the blue line is current, and what you see is that other than this group here, it benefits more through here than it would under that one. But for everything else, it's an overall greater benefit to these different groups. Here's Hispanic households. Up here is white non-Hispanic households. So the article, and so like I said, what I want you to do when you have these articles is I want you to tell me why they did this. So the reason why this group did this is they wanted to come up with a policy reason to improve the poverty of children. That was their point of this. So they did a lit review. So I would want you to talk some about the literature review and the articles that you have. So you'll talk a little bit about, they found that don't just read it to us, but kind of hit the high points. Then talk about how they wanted to go about testing it. Most of yours will be empirical articles, not all of them. I've kind of done a mix of empirical and non-empirical. So we've got that going on. And talk about, how they're planning on testing their research and then what their findings are. There'll be probably a fairly big section or probably 6-7 pages of a section, which will be their modeling and their statistics and all that. I understand the majority of you have not taken a class in econometrics, so trying to understand the statistics may be outside the scope of this class and outside the scope of your skill base. Don't worry about that part, but what I want you to focus on is, why are they doing this? Describe the background that leads to this, how they're going to do it, and what they find and what they recommend. So those are the 5 key points of when you do an article review for this class that I want you to focus on. Is these are the 5 areas that really should be focused on. Hopefully this helps understand, and hopefully you understand some of this information about childhood poverty. And let's see if I can stop recording. I can stop screen sharing.